When I was a kid in Greenwood, Indiana, I dreamed of adventure. Hidden treasure waiting to be found. Strange artifacts made by ancient people. And old maps leading to lost worlds. In my mind, these adventures were somewhere else, very far away, such as Egypt, Jordan, South America, Cambodia, anywhere but Indiana. But little did I know that ancient worlds were in my own backyard. Hidden across the landscape were ancient burial mounds, stone forts, and earthworks thousands of years before Indiana was even a state. And not only that, an old map to these places, telling of treasures and unknown people, was not hidden in a cold, dark cave. Instead, it was buried in a university archive, waiting to be found. It would lead me to amazing antiquities of the past that still remain. The literal X on the map. In the late 1800s, a geologist by the name of Edward Travers Cox was working for the state of Indiana. He compiled a listing of the state's natural resources, county by county, and published these findings in geological surveys. But what was curious about these reports were sections he titled Antiquities. He not only described ancient artifacts found, but entire cities long abandoned for thousands of years. Eventually, the list grew to over 2,000 ancient burial mounds and earthworks in Indiana. This included cities with walls as high as 17 feet tall. There were detailed descriptions of skeletons, strange copper jewelry, armor, and other implements of war. These items were very different from those of known Native Americans. Strangely, Native American people told early European settlers that they found these places. They didn't build them. And not only that, these unknown people had a confounding, advanced knowledge of the universe. These earthworks predicted annual solstices and equinoxes. These were all accomplished without telescopes, star charts, computers, or even measurement devices. It was both mysterious and perplexing. It raised many questions in my head. How did they do it? Who were these people really? And where did they come from? Starting at the very top of Indiana is Lake Michigan. While the shoreline speaks of sunshine and calm, below the surface are many mysterious clues to a very ancient past. In 2007, scientists looking for shipwrecks discovered a curious boulder. 5 feet wide and 4 feet tall, it had a petroglyph, an illustration of a mastodon. As mastodons went extinct about 10,000 years ago, this meant that someone carved it in antiquity, even before the pyramids were built in Egypt. But that was only the start. Also found was a circular structure made of large stones. It closely resembled Stonehenge across the Atlantic Ocean, a prehistoric timekeeping device. Now underwater, The boulder and Stonehenge-like structure were both created when water levels were much lower than they are today. This tells us several intriguing things. Number 1, that these items were created before the great melting of the Ice Age, making them some of the oldest man-made items on Earth. Number 2, this was home to one of the oldest civilizations that we know of. This is very uncharted territory that creates as many questions as it does answers. And finally, number 3, it challenges the belief that the earliest people of Indiana were simple and primitive. Simple and primitive people don't make structures aligned to stars with mathematical precision. Many examples of their work still remain across the Indiana landscape. And with the help of a nearly 150-year-old treasure map, I set out on a journey to find these lost ancient cities. There are still many ancient sites in Indiana, though they may not be advertised. They may be on private property, often hidden in the woods. Pyramid Mound at Vincennes, Indiana is the tallest mound in the state at 47 feet tall. It's hidden in the woods next to the highway. In late spring and summer, you can hardly see it. In contrast, the Sugarloaf Mound, located across town, is easily accessible. It's the second largest mound in Indiana at 44 feet tall. In the past, kids used to sled down its slope in the winter over hundreds of dead people. Some ancient mounds are hidden in plain sight, like the Chrysler Mound. It's located at the edge of the parking lot at Newcastle High School. This is a ceremonial mound with ancient rites unknown. We can only imagine what once went on here. Many times, they are only mentioned in the history of local archives, if you're lucky. You'll only find them with a dedicated amount of research. But I was traveling with a treasure map. I was not empty-handed. In the early days of our country, many white settlers recognized mounds as ancient cemeteries. They put new graves around them, respecting the grounds, such as here at Aurora, Indiana. And here at New Harmony, with many small mounds that have worn down over time. It's much the same story at Fredericksburg, with this one partitioned by a fence. But as they dotted all over the landscape, they hindered both farming and the building of roads. Countless mounds were destroyed. Having found unusual artifacts in the process, amateur archaeology became very popular. Many sites were plundered, sheerly for grave goods and bragging rights. And at the time, there was no law against it. These artifacts told an unusual story. For one, there was jewelry made from seashells from the Gulf of Mexico, hundreds of miles from the ocean. And items made of copper. As Indiana only has rare glacial deposits of copper, It came from somewhere else. In North America, copper occurs abundantly in Michigan, Canada, Montana, Utah, New Mexico, and Arizona, but not Indiana. It was very strange and hinted of a people used to traveling very long distances. They most likely used waterways to get places, and countless mounds were placed along them. From the shores of Lake Michigan to the banks of the Ohio River, and thousands of peaceful rivers and streams in between. Geologist Edward Cox made a crucial observation. These ancient people not only buried their dead along the waterways, but set up cities and lookout posts high above them. They wanted to see whom was coming and going from a distance. It made sense to have good visibility of potential enemies. Armed with this information and a book of maps, I hit the road with a great deal of anticipation. Whether or not I'd find anything more than a few burial mounds was yet to be seen. Some were hidden near highways, where thousands pass unknowingly. But I found much more than I ever dreamed. Actual ancient cities, still hidden in the woods. Including a prehistoric clock, one that still works after thousands of years. In my hands was a map showing 3 ancient settlements: Lawrenceburg, and a very large fort at Hardinsburg, Indiana, and across the Great Miami River in Ohio, a tall bluff with yet another ancient fort. I would start there and make my way west, traveling through thousands of years of ancient history. For a kid from Greenwood, Indiana, this was the kind of adventure I always dreamed about. Mixed with legends of ancient curses, advanced technologies, and even giants, I could hardly wait to get there. The ancient fort is part of Shawnee Lookout Park, so named as the last residents were Shawnee Indians. But they didn't build it, they found it. And that's what they told white settlers. It's clearly identified in the Indiana DeLorme Atlas and Gazetteer. This one would be a gimme. Others would take some detective work. At the start of the park, there was even a burial mound along the road, well before reaching the fort. It provided a false sense of how easy this adventure would be. It wouldn't. Old maps did not have the benefit of satellites, and after 200 years since the first description of these places, some waterways have even changed. But after all, uncertainty is part of the thrill. On an early Monday morning, I found an empty parking lot, a place totally deserted, and a trailhead beckoning me to come forth. For nearly 2 hours, it would be just me and the spirits of the past. If you have physical limitations, this is not a path to consider. There are lots of ups and downs, including a significant staircase. It starts off deceptively easy, but it doesn't stay that way. Downloading a map is a great idea. This plateau is much bigger than it looks on a tiny map. In fact, way bigger. And there are many side trails that can get you lost for hours. When you reach the first fork, you'll see the tip of the fort in front of you. It's a wide open plaza. When you walk here, you're walking on thousands of years of history. There are earthworks that make a wall around the perimeter. In antiquity, they were much taller than before erosion. I chose to hike around the fort and get a sense of how big it is. It is enormous. There are burial mounds around the perimeter as you go deeper and deeper into history. As I went deeper along the path, I could feel a strange sense of presence, an unreal, muffled quiet. I saw the sign that indicated I'd reached the end of the perimeter, but I chose to go on to the overlook. Up here is an outstanding view, partially eclipsed by summer foliage. Through this portal, I could see modern bridges and cars, unaware of my presence. And an unparalleled view of the river to see whom was coming and going for many miles. I could only think of the ancient eyes that stood here before me and their footsteps that I now traced. Going completely around the fort, I found stairs that went deeply into a ravine and abruptly required a climb upward. Back at the fort, thousands of years had passed, and all that remained was what I could feel. Coming here, some might only find a trail, some burial mounds, and a wall. But others like me, an experience, one that's very difficult to put into words. Back in Indiana, I found the Nan Mound site at Lawrenceburg. It was a decent-sized settlement of the Adena period. This is where archaeologist Glenn Black did an immense amount of research. Going back about 1,000 years, it provided some very intriguing insights, some very disturbing. At its heart was a massive burial mound, 198 feet long, 90 feet wide, and 15 feet tall. As the Adena people buried their dead from east to west, Glenn Black excavated in that pattern. If there was an ancient curse to be claimed, it was chiggers, tiny insects that lived in the grass and bit everyone that worked at the site. But perseverance paid off, and found beneath the mound was a skull. But curiously, without a body. There was speculation that these ancient people were buried with the heads of their enemies. They might even be headhunters, possibly even cannibals. Having found a large stone below the skull, a burial chamber was imminent. The chamber was once made of logs, and the mound's clay formed around it and solidified. It had been so long ago that the logs had turned into dust. Professor Black described the skeleton as some kind of warrior chieftain adorned with a shell necklace. This was a very old find, from a time before known Native Americans. Categorized as Adena, it only solidified what we know of their strange culture and customs. As described in the Indianapolis News of October 1934, the skeleton was surrounded by numerous skulls without bodies, a very telling, if not unsettling discovery. History is history. It doesn't have to be easy to read or understand. Famous for his work at Angel Mounds in Evansville, Indiana, he used a magnetometer to look for artifacts and unusual cavities in the earth. A great deal was found here and taken back to Indiana University at Bloomington. I couldn't help but look at the ground and hope that something was somehow missed, but I found nothing. Just a deserted prairie where secrets are suspected but never told. And a burial mound once opened, creating more questions than answers. What intrigued me most was an ancient fort above Hardinsburg. Known as the Obertin Fort, it was surrounded by a large wall. The only way in was through a big tower at its entrance. At least 8 burial mounds were also on the large plateau. This absolutely had me stoked, but how to find it? Starting with a satellite map, I superimposed the old map, attempting to line it up with the bends of the Great Miami and Ohio rivers. But the path of those rivers either changed or were slightly off scale. They could not be lined up precisely. I noticed that the old fort at Hardinsburg was nearly even with the fort in Ohio, so I made grid lines. By simply removing the older map, it revealed the likely location of the fort. I looked for any road leading up and into the interior, and I found it. Obertin Road. As I was looking for the Obertin Fort, it had to be the right spot. So I headed for Hardinsburg and found the large ridge popping up from the landscape. I took the first road leading up the hillside as adrenaline surged through my system. Second by second, getting closer to the target, and wondering what I'd find after several thousand years. This could be nothing, or it could totally be something. And then, the private property sign. I'd been to this rodeo before, finding a castle in the woods, making 3 documentaries, and then receiving a letter from a lawyer saying I trespassed on private property. With the threat of legal action, they asked me to take down all the videos. I had no intention of taking that ride twice. Searching online, I found university papers summarizing studies conducted at the old fort. There was some LiDAR photos, but no mention of an ancient tower or U-shaped fort walls. High-resolution satellite imagery didn't show anything. And unlike other ancient sites throughout the state, there wasn't a single picture of the fort. Even though I legally couldn't go there, perhaps there was nothing left to see. I called the local archaeology organization and left my number. While disappointed, I still had other sites to find. And at the end of this journey, I'd be glad I went. My next map sent me to Winchester, Indiana. This massive ancient city took up 31 acres, where the White River and Sugar Creek meet. Built by the Hopewell people, the walls were 1,080 feet by 1,320 feet. They were 7 to 10 feet tall and around 25 feet wide. It was a significant place. At the center was a mound 180 feet in diameter and 15 feet tall. And it wasn't placed there at random. A study completed by Ball State University proved that the mound and the walls were aligned to celestial objects. The builders of this complex were not simple people at all. They were well organized and had a complex knowledge of astronomy. In the late 1800s, the plaza was made into the Randolph County Fairgrounds. People used to sit on the ancient walls to watch events at the fair. Geologist Edward Cox himself sat on the mound to watch a horse race. It was called Fudge Mound. But where is this city today? The Randolph County Historical Society introduced me to a wealth of information. From excavations throughout the county, ancient copper artifacts, and old maps that I could compare to the satellite images. But I wouldn't have to go very far to find the remains of this ancient city. A building across from the courthouse, like so many others, was built from the fort. The mighty ancient walls of clay were dug out and used to make bricks. There is no longer an ancient city along the White River and Sugar Creek. Wearing modern goggles, it's a complete loss to history, thousands of years wasted that we'll never get back. But in the early days of Winchester, it was only building materials that were badly needed. My next map took me to Newcastle, Indiana, in one of the most incredible ancient sites in the state. The Newcastle Complex. The city was surrounded by a huge earthen wall that included moats. It was very substantial. As described in 1937, it had 9 C-shaped enclosures, assumed to be used for religious ceremonies. There were also 4 mounds and several odd earthworks, whose purpose is unknown. The grounds can still be seen by satellite, but it's no longer in its former glory. At one point, much of the complex was leveled to make a hospital. That hospital is also now gone. Today, it's the Wilbur Wright shooting range. It was yet another loss for ancient history. The question in my head after the last 2 stops is nothing sacred. From an ancient city built by an unknown people, then occupied by Native Americans, then white settlers, then made into a hospital, then a shooting range. We all recycle what's in front of us. History always repeats itself. Someday, another people will come to this land and make it something else. Nothing stays the same. One ancient map remained at Anderson, Indiana, Mounds State Park. Described in detail by Edward Cox, this was a very unusual place. There are 10 mounds here, including a prehistoric clock that still keeps time. These people knew their astronomy. It was first occupied by ancient Adena, then Hopewell, and Mississippian people, and after that, both Miami and Potawatomi Native Americans before white settlers. Occupied for well over 2,000 years, it's a prime example of recycling. The massive Great Mound conjures up images of mystery, with ancient people performing rituals. This C-shaped mound is 300 feet across. The ditch around it is 10 feet deep. To walk around it is a 1.25 mile trip. It is certainly impressive. Nearby is the Fiddleback Mound, named for its unusual shape. Together, the mounds on this plain predict solstices and equinoxes without fail. No one knows how ancient people did this. There are mounds all over this 290-acre park. Some are fading into the past, and others still provide wonder for generations. In the past, there were 3 caves underneath these mounds. There were even postcards showing them. At one point, a little girl was lost inside the cave system. As the story goes, when they went into the cave to rescue her, they also found ancient artifacts of the mound builders. The 3 caves were sealed by blasting them with dynamite. No one knows what was found, if anything at all. There's a lot of legends here, including tales of spirits that walk the trails. Known as puckwudgies, they resemble trolls with exaggerated facial features. Some long-term park employees swear that they've seen them. Truth or tall tale, it only adds to the mystery of this very ancient place. It's been nearly 150 years since Edward Cox published these intriguing maps, and yet the mystery of these ancient cities and their builders still remain. There are still many ancient sites across the state of Indiana, such as Angel Mounds at Evansville. Places that you and I can visit, walk the grounds, and think of a mysterious earlier time. There are some you've never heard of, such as Wapasickee-Sipowee at Fairbanks, Indiana. Browning Mountain at Brown County, a place where ancient people created a long hilltop wall made of stone, and what looks like remnants of a temple. Rose Island at Charlestown, where early settlers found remnants of a stone castle. Earthworks, and a long stone wall above the ridge. But many remain on private property, such as Troxell's Horseshoe in Perry County. It's a stone structure that was already ancient when Native Americans found it. There are rumors of effigies resembling serpents hidden in the woods. Rocky ledges with carved faces, and ancient artifacts that could change history and our perception of the past. But for many reasons, those that know no longer tell. The federal government has prosecuted many Hoosiers for their finds. Universities and museums have came to southern Indiana. They've excavated ancient sites, have taken away artifacts that are never seen again. If people find something, if they know something, they never talk about it. Mysteries to stay mysteries, and questions to remain unanswered. And yet, in the back of our minds, we know there's an elusive and unprinted X on the map.